This is Schoharie Crossing's winter program series, History at Home. You've tuned in today for a wonderful presentation. Ken Jones is the town historian for Esperance, New York, and the president of the Esperance Historical Society and Museum. I recently ended working part-time training procurement staff at the University of Albany, SUNY, where he was the Assistant Director Emeritus of that department, and continues to train on the topic of procurement online and for several other online training companies. He's finishing up a biography on the subject of this presentation, General William North. So we're going to take a look at the early years, and we are very lucky, very honored to have with us this evening Ken Jones. Please.
Okay, Dave, thanks and welcome to the program. As mentioned, just finishing up a book on General North's life. General North was the founder of our village here in Esperance. That's why there's the interest. He lived a lot of years in Duanesburg, just down the road, and is buried under the Christ Episcopal Church on Route 20. So what we're going to do, since I've got a whole book just being edited right now, we're going to look at his early years. We're going to look at his family, how they got to America. We're going to go through up until the reading of the Declaration of Independence, being that's what we're going to be celebrating this year. So that's where we're going to end it. There's a lot more that hasn't been said on this program. In other words, there's a whole lot more history that General North was involved in. But we're going to start anyway with William's family. His detailed genealogy was written and published by his nephew in A History of Augusta, Maine. It's a very thick book, and David Vincent gave me a copy of it. And David lives in the North Mansion, the house that William North built in Duanesburg, still stands on North Mansion Road. And this large book, it tells a lot about the North family. In addition, William North wrote his own unpublished family history that was probably shared with his nephew, who wrote the book on the history of Augusta, Maine. And he wrote that his great-grandfather, John North, settled in Westmeath, Ireland around 1650. And William's grandfather, also named John North. Anybody that does genealogy, there's like 3 generations of John Norths here. And John North came to America with William's father, who was also John North, who was referred to as John Jr. I think we just lost our.
Yeah, we lost your presentation again, Ken.
Let me see if I can get that back.
Yeah.
Magic of, there we go. We're back again. Okay. So anyway, when his grandfather and his grandfather's son and 2 daughters, which was William North's father and his aunts, he referred to, there were 3 sisters. He says, I remember my aunts, they were well-educated women and possessed of accomplishments not very common in those days, such as music, dancing, embroidery, and etc. They are all gone, and I have no, and they have left no progeny that I know of that are very respectable. I've understood that he, Grandfather North, was a religious man. His daughters, I know, were pious. They arrived at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in their own ship with the family and servants. They first settled in North Yarmouth, Maine around 1720, and then 1731 they bought land at Pemaquid, Maine. Pemaquid is located about halfway up the rocky coast of Maine, north of Portland. North recalled his mother Elizabeth had an estate in North Yarmouth and sold it when he was 10 or 12 years old. Now we'll take a look at the area that we're going to be talking about in the state of Maine, and that shows you pointing towards the Pemaquid area. The Pemaquid area was not fertile for farming so lumbering and fishing were the primary vocations. And in later years, William North will be noted as a great fisherman by other people that were fishing with him. His father, John Jr., learned the surveyor's trade and became an accomplished surveyor whose large maps are still to this day valued and preserved. He was employed by land agents Thomas and Shem Drown and other landowners to survey their patents. The farm he acquired was given to him by Thomas Drown. Now, often surveyors, when they had large tracts, would possibly as part of their payment would get some kind of a piece of land out of that survey. It was situated at the head of the western branch of Johns River at Pemaquid, where Fort Frederick was located. Um, and then around 1736, they move again to the St. George's River area to settle on lands of General Samuel Waldo. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that the state of Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820. So the chief executive was the governor of Massachusetts. On July 17, 1733, John Jr. was commissioned as a judge by Governor Belcher. It was said that he was able to get the parties to settle without going to trial by laughing or scolding them into an agreement. So I got to tell my friend Tom, this town justice, that from now on he's got to laugh or scold them into an agreement. Before 1739, he married Elizabeth Lewis, who was referred to as a woman of great personal beauty of Scottish descent. With her, he had a son, Joseph, born 1739, and a daughter, Mary, born 1742. Judge North's father, who established the family at Pemaquid, died in 1740. Now we're going to look at a little close-up of where that arrow is pointing in the map. And we'll see here the two main forts we're going to be talking about for the next little section here. And that's Fort Frederick down in the southern part here. And then you've got Fort St. George north about 10 miles. Anticipating a war with France, the frontier was put in a posture of defense. In 1744, King George's War broke out, another French and Indian War. This threatened settlers outside the forts, many of whom fled to Boston or other large towns, where they stayed until 1748 when the war was over. John North Jr. was appointed a lieutenant at Fort Frederick, Pemaquid, Maine. And Fort Frederick is the one on the southern section of this map here. The Indians captured a woman after she was wounded. There was an invading party that left after they left Fort St. George. They came to Pemaquid. And the Indians captured a woman, but she was wounded, but managed to escape and get into the fort and warn the members in the fort, and the Indians being discovered retreated from the area. Farmers' cattle were often killed in raids, and families attacked, killed, or taken prisoner to Canada. And if you look at this map, you can see there's a whole lot of forts in a short, small area, it looks like. So, it was a dangerous area, and they have a lot of forts there to protect the people in the communities. In 1747, 100 Indians attacked the fort and surrounding neighborhood, killing 5 soldiers garrisoned at the fort and many others. The invading forces were eventually repulsed. Later that fall, 60 Indians approached Fort Frederick about daybreak, again hoping to surprise the garrison. A short distance from the pickets, a group of 5 soldiers of the fort were discovered, and at the first volley from the enemy, 3 were killed and 2 wounded. And the invaders then attacked the fort during a 2-hour engagement, but withdrew without doing much damage. The following year, news of a preliminary peace motivated the officers at the fort to keep the Indians tranquil. And a trading house opened up at Fort St. George, about 10 miles north of Fort Frederick. During this period, John Jr.'s wife died, and he married Elizabeth Pittston of Boston, daughter of James and Hannah Pittston, on July 31st, 1746. North, as a surveyor, was appointed surveyor to the Kennebec proprietors and surveyed the Kennebec patent in 1750. Here we'll see a section of the map, and this is the section of the map where William North is certifying his father's signature. The map is actually 9 by 4 feet, so it was a very large survey that he had done. Captain North wrote to the governor when he found that there was going to be an attack at the fort, possibly. And in the spring, um, he received an express from Fort St. George that they should warn their inhabitants of a possible invasion. The enemy harassment had prevented the farmers from spring planting and lumbering, and they had used up their stores while going to the fort to wait out the danger. Captain North wrote to the governor for support, as there were only 6 men at the large fort. In the summer, Captain North notified Lieutenant Governor Phipps that Captain Sanders had been at Fort Frederick and informed him that the Indians took 7 men and killed a number of cattle at New Meadows. North also mentioned hearing several alarms, but had no information as to what took place. For better communications, Captain North asked for a good boat and oars and men so that he could discharge his duty as became a soldier. He asked that if new soldiers were sent, to send Western men, for the inhabitants around the Fort Frederick area were so busy with lumbering and getting in hay for the cattle that they couldn't attend to their militia duty. Captain North, being a magistrate, judge, surveyor, and captain of a fort, no doubt gained for him not only honors, but also detractors. One of these was William Loud, a former captain of a vessel in Portsmouth. He had left his family and was living with a woman as a squatter on an island that was later named for him and also went by Muscongas Island. And you'll see that arrow is pointing towards the island in this map, which legend had it was the final resting place of Samoset. In October of 1753, North was ordered to arrest Loud on a complaint by Elizabeth Burns, and after apprehending him, to transport Elizabeth Burns and the 2 sons to Arrowswick in the captain's boat. So apparently at this time, the captain's request for a boat and oars had been fulfilled. His son Joseph also joined him at this time as a soldier at Fort Frederick. In another interaction, Loud applied for a supply of provisions but was denied by Captain North. In response, Loud in the late 1750s tried to have him removed as captain of the fort by writing to the governor and council that, and this is in quotes, Oswego is gone, Ticonderoga is gone, and 2 old squaws can take Pemaquid, end of quote. Later, when Captain North was engaged to survey the island, Loud met his boat with a pistol in hand, threatening whomever it was that first set foot on the island that he would shoot him. But Captain North, not to be cowed by him, stepped out of the boat and very coolly approached him, and Loud, realizing threats were to no avail, said, "Oh, Johnny, is that you?" And the survey was made without further interference. In April 1754, Governor Shirley wrote to the proprietors of the Kennebec Purchase from the lake colony New Plymouth, noting the assembly desired that Fort Richmond be replaced by a new fort further up the Kennebec River. He made a deal with them: if they would build a fort at Cushnock, he would build one at Taconic. To accomplish this, Samuel Goodwin, an agent for the Kennebec proprietors, wrote to Captain North on May 8th from Fort Richmond, desiring that Captain North leave Pemaquid immediately and meet him at Taconic Falls with his instruments for surveying and planning. Goodwin noted he was waiting for Captain North to arrive before he could start. So in other words, hurry up and get here. The survey work to be performed by Captain North was going to be a considerable amount of time. So he wouldn't be able to return right away, so the captain needed to arrange coverage for his absence at Fort Pemaquid before he left. He forwarded a letter to the captain from the governor granting North leave from the fort and to bring a sufficient number of men well armed under Goodwin, as this was a time of Indian wars. Goodwin cautioned Captain North, "Fail not of bringing everything necessary. You must bring your whaleboat and a corps of 4 men, for we shall want them to go to Taconic, and then you may send for home." The fort site surveyed became Fort Halifax. North also surveyed for the Plymouth proprietors and inhabitants. The North map he created that year is in the collection of the Maine Historical Society collection and is available and will be available online. Captain North sent to Governor Shirley in May a warning that the French are building a fort on the back of Mount Desert Hills, according to Captain Jabez Bradbury, who was the previous captain before North. During this time, the governor was attempting to schedule a meeting with the local Indian tribes so that all matters between us may be amicably agreed upon and settled. And that was the purpose of that meeting. The next year, 1755, was a happy event in the family of Captain North, as his wife Elizabeth had a son they named William. One can only imagine being born in a fort and what that experience would bring to William as he grew up. No doubt he was exposed to his father's trade of surveying and had a much older brother and sister to look up to. His father, a leader at the fort and in the community, no doubt shaped young William's mind of what a successful life was like and what would be expected of him. The French and Indian War was on, and Massachusetts declared war in 1755 on the Indian tribes, recruiting soldiers and encouraging volunteers, offering bounties for scalps. Now, these are bounties for scalps for the Indians. In other words, they were scalping Indians and turning in the Indian scalps for bounty money. A volunteer militia indiscriminately killed previously exempted Penobscot Indians. The local Indian tribe was not to be killed, but they evidently didn't get the message, and eventually the violence erupted between the Penobscots and the settlers, and they were no longer exempted. And then the state of Massachusetts took action and passed a bill that basically said that the government of Massachusetts is ordering their subjects to kill every and all Indians. In February of 1757, a group from Harrington and Pemaquid petitioned Spencer Phipps, the lieutenant governor commander in chief, and the House of Representatives to write their grievances as to the way Fort Frederick at Pemaquid was operating under Captain North. They stated that there were supposed to be 20 soldiers assigned, yet there was no guard or sentinel by day for months, and they assumed none were posted at night as no one answered to calls at the gate. They mocked the quality of the captain of the soldiers that were stationed there and said they were all on an island cutting wood for the captain to sell at market. His son and a black boy are seen fishing in a schooner. The ones left at the fort were all drunk on alcohol supplied by the captain to the point where they were not fit for duty. One soldier lay outside the fort in the snow, and if one of the inhabitants had not secured the man and took him into their home to warm him, he would have died of exposure. The government supplied schooner was used to transport the soldiers to cut the captain's wood and was now frozen in the ice. Some inhabitants who requested to have a room at the fort or to build a shelter there were denied, yet there were rooms occupied by sheep, horses, and a place for weaving. They complained they were exposed to grave dangers from the French and Indians and asked the captain be replaced with someone faithful to the trust vested in him for the security of the inhabitants. In April, the House of Representatives called on the lieutenant governor to summon Captain North to Boston to answer for the charges. Now you can imagine that's quite a trip to go from here to Boston. But also they wanted to have the representatives of the accusers appear at the same time. Captain North obtained a witness statement from Ebenezer Hall, a man hired to cut wood for the fort, and mentioned that Captain North was just a honest man in all his dealings with me. The deposition was witnessed by the Justice of the Peace and one other person. The justice was Captain North, and the witness was Boyce Cooper, his brother-in-law. Now, this is my favorite postcard view of Fort Frederick. Now, this is only a portion of it that was restored around 1909. But as you can see, they already got an ice cream stand set up over there for them to for the tourists that were coming at that early day. Originally, this was Fort William Henry, and then the fort at Pemaquid was rebuilt over that, the one that's been restored, as you see there, as was known as Fort Frederick after Fort William Henry. It appears that North's commission, after this upset with the people wanting him gone, he got moved to Fort St. George, where Jabez Bradbury had been the captain and had resigned. So I don't believe any trial was held, rather he was relocated. North's commission was dated August 14, 1758. His son Joseph North, though young, was for a time in charge of Fort Frederick. Muster rolls list Joseph North as sentinel and Boyce Cooper, brother-in-law, as captain, and a corporal in his company at Fort Frederick. It appears that Captain North may have gone back and forth between the two forts because muster rolls for 1758 show him present at both of them. The new lieutenant at Fort St. George was a surgeon, a former clerk at the fort, and a surveyor by the name of John McChesney. Now here we'll see what's really cool is if you go there today to this rebuilt section of the fort, you'll see this plaque on the outside of the fort. And it tells you the short history of Captain John North, the father, Colonel Joseph North, his son, and William North's half brother, and William North himself. So William North is on the outside of the fort. He was the first white male or white person born in that fort. If you go there to Pemaquid, you will see the fort house, which is now a museum and storage library. Some say this dates from the early 1700s, but some think it was the late 1700s, even later than when William North was there. But that building is used for storage and a library. And inside of there, you'll see a picture of William North, talking about him being the first person that was born in the fort. And this is actually inside of the fort house. Now, right now, the captain is moved to Fort St. George. This is an artist's rendition of what they think Fort St. George looked like. They're not exactly sure 100% where the fort was located today. And there is this artist's description based, on what she read and drew this based on historical accounts. In the summer of 1758, the new governor, Thomas Pownall, received a notice from Nova Scotia that a body of French soldiers, aided by some St. John, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy Indians, were planning an assault on Fort St. George and surrounding settlements. He immediately took what recruits were available and went off on the ship King George and the sloop Massachusetts to support the 35 soldiers stationed at Fort St. George and surroundings. After leading off the additional soldiers and military stores, the fort was attacked by a body of 400 French and Indians within 36 hours. The contest lasted one day when the enemy drew off without either suffering or doing much injury. The fort was commanded by Mr. North, and according to James Sullivan in his Maine history of 1795, he was commanded by North, a valiant and worthy man. And that was written in 1795, so not too many decades after the event happened. It also mentioned that Captain Bradbury was there at the fort during the attack, but was not in charge of the fort. Over 50 years later, William North, his son of Captain North, recalled hearing of the stories of the battle at the fort. But he was mistaken when he thought it happened in 1762-63, as it actually happened in 1758, if his birth date is correct. In other words, everything says 1755, but doesn't give a day or a month or anything. So if this happened in 1758, it would have been about 3 years old, or a little between 3 and 4, if his birthday year is correct at 1755. He does remember carrying a small barrel of powder with his father's help to the platform where 9-pounders were placed and then fired at the enemy. This was most likely drill at a later time, as he said he was 7 or 8 years old. North remembered that a treaty was entered into, and so strongly was I struck by the look of the Indians as they sat at the feast given in the fort on its being concluded, with their knives, tomahawks, breastplates, and armbands of silver and horrid looks, that the appearance is present at the moment to my mind's eye. In May 1759, Governor Pownall met with the local Indian tribe representatives to talk peace and trade at Fort St. George, although a formal peace treaty was not agreed upon at that time. And that's probably the meeting that William North was a witness to. The fort at Pemaquid, Fort Frederick, was dismantled in 1759. That year, Captain North was appointed examiner by Governor Pownall on his expedition to the Penobscot. Fort Pownall was constructed on this expedition and led to the discontinuance of Fort St. George in 1762, which is what we see here. In 1760, upon the formation of Lincoln County, Captain North was appointed a judge of the Court of Common Pleas. His relationship with Dr. John McKechnie, his lieutenant at Fort St. George, was said to be disagreeable, and that he, a surveyor himself, criticized the accuracy of some of the captain's surveys. You can imagine that didn't go down very well. And then to find out, his daughter Mary, that's Captain North's daughter Mary, ended up marrying Dr. McChesney in January of 1760. The captain was not happy. He later that year drafted his will, and because of her, quote, undutifulness in contracting marriage with a man who was not to my good liking, end of quote, left her only 10 pounds in his will. Upon the dismission of the garrison at Fort St. George in 1762, Captain North continued to reside there and was granted a license to operate a tavern. So evidently he was good at serving alcohol. As peace settled in, immigrants flowed into the area and found temporary housing at the fort. While giving satisfaction as a judge through 1762, it was said in his final days he had mind problems and saw things that were not there and would strike out at an imaginary animal with his cane. If this was so, it must have been difficult for his 8-year-old son William to witness. On the 26th of March, 1763, the captain, surveyor, and magistrate passed away. The extensive inventory taken after his decease, including a long list of common everyday items of that day, including 104 ounces of plate, that included a tankard kept in the family for generations, which you see here, was auctioned off with the William North's and Steuben effects in 1929. The will also referenced a black man named Ezram, with his bedding and his clothes were part of the estate. Joseph and William each got 1/4 of their father's estate. Of course, William's mother would be handling William's affairs as he was yet a minor child. North wrote that the estate was chiefly personal money in the treasury of the then province, which was afterwards drawn out and loaned to Mr. John Wheelwright and Charles Ward Apthorpe and lost by their bankruptcy. Joseph had received his portion of the estate earlier, so that the loss fell on William and his mother, and it was a great loss. This is General Knox Mansion that you can see today near Thomaston in Thomaston, Maine. This is a reproduction. This building was built around 1930, I believe, and is not exactly where the original mansion was. The original mansion was built near the fort. And Captain North's last resting place included a tombstone with a heart-shaped lead plate inserted in it, listing all the details of his life and death at the cemetery near Fort St. George, now near Thomaston, Maine. His obituary carried in a newspaper dated June 18, 1763, that noted his skill in settling disputes among the inhabitants that came before him without suffering any to go into law. Now, what is interesting about this Knox mansion is Mrs. Knox um, didn't like the fact that her view looked over the cemetery. So at some point while Mr. Knox was away, she had people come in and remove all the headstones from the cemetery. So those eventually disappeared. They said the lead plate was used to make bullets taken from Captain North's tombstone. So later on, we won't get that far, but William North ends up reporting to Henry Knox. So it's ironic that his wife takes William North's father's tombstone away and it gets lost. Captain North's widow, Elizabeth Pittston, took her young son, William, and stepson Joseph back to Boston where her family was located. Her father, James, had been a merchant in Boston, but by this date, both of her parents had died, so she would not be going to live with them. Her sister, Hannah, had married Gershom Flagg as a second wife, was living in Boston in the home inherited by her husband at 56 Hanover Street. Her husband was wealthy, being a proprietor of the Plymouth Company, owning land that became the center of Augusta, Maine, and a housewright and glazier by profession. Gershom was a contractor and accompanied Governor Pownall in the 1759 expedition to build Fort Pownall in Maine and carried on some of the work. Gershom also worked on other forts in the region, including Fort Richmond and Fort Halifax. Gershom Flagg had 7 children with Hannah, and their daughter, Hannah Flagg, caught the eye of William's half-brother, Joseph North. They married August 28, 1764. Hannah was noted as having a great force of character, generous, benevolent, and beloved by those who knew her. Joseph North followed the surveyor's trade like his father. They soon moved to Lancaster, Massachusetts, and started a family. And before the Revolution in 1772 returned to Maine and settled on a farm in Gardnerstown, once owned by James Flagg, where Joseph would become a prominent citizen, provincial congressman, militia officer, and judge. Young William was accepted into the Boston Latin School, then a prominent free school that had already been turning out graduates ready for college since the 1600s, and is today the oldest school in the country. The schoolmaster since 1734 had been John Lavelle. John Lavelle was known as the pride of Boston parents and the terror of its youth. When William entered the school around 1764, he would also meet the schoolmaster's son, James, given the title of usher. The 2 instructors had desks at opposite ends of the schoolroom. The master, Old Gaffer as they called him, his desk was at the southwest corner, and James the usher was at the northeast corner. The father and son teachers were of different minds when it came to the politics of the day, with Master John being an ardent Tory, those loyal to the British throne, and James being an ardent Whig. The classes were broken into 7 units, each unit having a bench or what they referred to as a form. William's first year would have included the use of the books Cheever's Accidents and Corderius Colloquius, and his second Aesop's Fables, followed by published grammar textbooks. You can tell I'm not a classically trained person. You can tell by these books that these students were being prepared for college. The 4th year, William would have had a desk and commenced making Latin, as the phrase was used at that time. The highest classes being the 5th and 6th would study Xenophon and Homer. William was later noted as being a good scholar in general. The discipline of the school was light, with the master using a fair rule, a flat ruler with a widened end. Students usually received 2 claps of the ruler, 1 on each hand. James the usher was much more creative as to his use of the fair rule, but did not brandish his fair rule until his father was out of the room. His method was compared to resemble the motion of a flail in the hands of an expert thrasher. So I guess you didn't want to have the son spanking you if you could avoid it. The school started at 7 in the summer and 8 in the winter. At around 11, the greater part of the students went to a writing school or stayed and took lessons from James the usher. This seems to be one of the most useful classes for William, as his writing skills would get him recommendations for promotion in his early years. The school day resumed at 1 and ended at 5. School opened to a short prayer and ended with Deponite Libros, put down your books. On Thursdays, classes ended at 10 for the opportunity to attend the Thursday lecture. The boys could recess at 8 at a time into the yard and requested permission by presenting a club near the master's nose. Now that sounds dangerous to me. Who would nod approval. No words were spoken. When they returned, the next group of 8 would follow the same procedure to go out and play. During the winter, it was common for the boys to bring their sleds to school, and as soon as school was over, to coast down Beacon Street, across Tremont, and down School Street. Many of the boys graduated from the Boston Latin School and went on to Harvard or some other college. William is not recorded as having graduated, although he wrote that he studied Latin 6 years. Some of his fellow alums would play a role in his personal and professional life. Just as William was entering the Boston Latin School, Henry Knox had to leave early to help support his family as his father had left. William Eustace's term at the school overlapped that of William, and we'll get a picture of Mr. Eustace here. And they became lifelong friends. William Eustace would look after, being that he's located in Boston, would look after William North's mother. So he was like the one that checked in on William North's mother all the time she was alive. William Eustace's term at the school overlapped that of William's, and they became lifelong friends after meeting through the Revolutionary War, if not from the school. Eustace was a couple years older than William and went on to Harvard and graduated in 1772. He studied medicine afterwards under Dr. Joseph Warren, and previous attendees at this school included John Hancock and Samuel Adams. So you wonder what this school really did with that type of a thing, as far as, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, find a whole bunch of people that are really prominent in the Revolution went to school at the Boston Latin School. William had, for some years under different masters, been preparing to go into one of the learned professions. Because of the bankruptcy, he did not go to college, but was instead to be trained as a merchant, following the profession of his late grandfather Pitson. His cousin James Flagg was a merchant in Boston and sold his Maine property to William North's half-brother Joseph, who then moved to Maine. His cousin Josiah Flagg was a musician and a publisher of music, as well as a boyhood friend of Paul Revere, pictured here. Josiah and Paul Revere both signed up to play and care for the bells at what was later called the Old North Church in Boston. Josiah is listed among a group of the Sons of Liberty who were dining at the Liberty Tree in 1769. While we don't have references as to the merchant William was apprenticed to, we do have a reference to when his apprenticeship unexpectedly ended. William moved to Boston in time to see it become a hotbed for revolutionaries. Boston was a thorn in the side of Great Britain and a constant battle over self-governance and taxation. Brooke Barbier's 2017 book on Boston and the Revolution is aptly subtitled A Town versus an Empire. As William said, he spent 6 years studying Latin. He probably started his merchant apprenticeship around 1770 when he was 15. The merchant class in particular were impacted by the taxes imposed by the mother country, the custom officials who enforced them, and the retaliatory boycotts followed by the patriots of Massachusetts. Often mobs formed to attack the custom agents and other royal tax collectors, including damaging their homes and threatening their lives. Then the Crown would impose additional restrictions, including bringing British troops to be housed in Boston. The boycott of British goods made for hard decisions for the merchants, whose livelihood depended on British imports, and they suffered economically or were subject to the same harassment as the custom agents and unwanted soldiers. The young boys in Boston were not above tormenting the soldiers or participating in the stoning of custom agents' homes or merchant shops for not obeying the boycotts. They in turn risked getting caught up in the deadly response from the soldiers being backed into a corner. William North must have at least witnessed all of this. A boy of 11 was shot and killed by a supposed informer to the custom agents who was defending his home from a mob in February of 1770. At his funeral march, made into a political statement, 400 boys led the mourners. The following month, there was the famous Boston Massacre. A surprising twist was finding John Adams successfully defending the British soldiers and others accused of murder during the massacre. In May 1773, with the tax on tea and the monopoly on English tea in the East India Company, the Boston Patriots were infuriated. That summer, William's cousin, James Flagg, the merchant, died on the island of St. Eustatius, a prominent island in the West Indies, known for being a major port for the transshipment of goods. Among the executor of James' estate was William's half-brother, Joseph North, and Thomas Crafts as the attorney for the administration of the estate, and Gershom Flagg, the brother of the deceased. By December, the ships full of English tea arrived in Boston Harbor, and the Patriots met to decide what to do to prevent the unloading, paying the tax, and distribution of the tea. They asked the ship owners to return to England without unloading the tea. Some said it was impossible to do as they were required to show proof that the tax was paid in Boston should they return to England. And this would be a true hardship as well. Outside the formal large illegal meetings of Boston residents at Faneuil Hall, a group was organized to seize the tea and throw it in the harbor. Thomas Crafts, although referenced as an attorney for the estate in newspapers, was actually a Japaner, an ornamental painter. He was also a mason and the leader of Boston Whig mechanics, those that work with their hands, such as day laborers. His early military experience, including being in the Massachusetts militia, serving as an officer in Paddock's Artillery Company. He was also honored with being made a member of the ancient and honorable Artillery Company of Massachusetts. He was a member of the Loyal Nine, which became the Sons of Liberty. On December 16th, Crafts participated in the Boston Tea Party, and besides throwing the tea overboard, also supplied the Mohawk dress and delivered it to Sarah Bradley Fulton, who is credited with coming up with the idea of disguising the participants as Mohawk Indians. The response from the throne in the British Parliament was called the Coercive Acts. One of these acts was to close the port of Boston in 1774, which put William North out of a job with a merchant he had worked with. On June 17, 1775, at the Battle of Bunker Hill during the siege of Boston, his friend William Eustis was acting as a military surgeon, and his mentor, Dr. Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and Committee of Safety, was acting as a common soldier as his general's commission had not yet arrived. The Patriots held off the British assault, causing significant losses to the British until ammunition ran low. Daniel Shays was one of the officers from Massachusetts that day. Warren, one of the last to leave Breed's Hill, was shot and killed. Papers found on his corpse led to the arrest of Whig James Lavelle, the usher at William's former school. Eventually, Master Lavelle and his son James closed the Boston Latin School and go to Canada, one as a British loyalist and the other as a prisoner. William is mentioned as joining the army at the age of 19. In 1775, George Washington wanted to invade Quebec, Canada, to assist in splitting some of the British forces away from Montreal, where General Philip Schuyler was preparing to invade through New York State. General Schuyler was under orders from Congress to invade Canada and was being criticized for the time it was taking him. Washington was looking at an invasion route through Maine, was getting reports both verbal and written of possible river routes to take. A timely appearance by Benedict Arnold, looking for an appointment in the new Continental Army, landed him being made a colonel of the secret expedition. It was to be a short action, and volunteers were recruited. Volunteers were to supply their own weapons and clothing. Among the gentlemen volunteers was Aaron Burr. They were not just looking for any volunteers, but for those acquainted with bateaus, a shallow draft, flat bottom boat, and working and living in the woods. Many were recruited by officers who knew them from their hometowns or were veterans of previous battles such as Bunker Hill. Arnold had recently returned from action at the taking of Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen. Now over 1,000 troops and their baggage needed to be transported on the river using bateaus, so a large number were needed quickly. The depot for supplies and the manufacturing of the boats was completed in Gardnerstown, Maine, and Reuben Colburn had the contract. He performed amazingly well, producing 200 bateaus in under 3 weeks. Gardnerstown is located along the Kennebec River, while Colburn had a shipyard. In 1774-75, Joseph North, William's half-brother, was the representative of Gardnerstown in the provincial Congress. He was a leading man of the plantation and an ardent, uncompromising Whig, and the people generally joined him, it was said. While the production of the boats in such a short time frame was impressive, the boats themselves were not. According to North, who wrote about them almost 40 years later, the boats for Arnold's expedition on the Kennebec were in the trees only 6 days before they're in the water. The consequence was they leaked like a sieve. Provisions and ammunition was spoiled, and the men happy to get to the shore with their lives. William signed up for the expedition. However, he was prevented from proceeding because of illness, according to the Augusta, Maine history written by his nephew. The British were aware of the secret expedition, and General Howe noted that upon the rebels reaching Fort Halifax, they sent about 200 back that were sick. This is a significant percentage of Arnold's expedition. We do not know if William was among this number or was returned sick earlier. It was probably lucky for him, as most of Arnold's men that made it through the arduous trek through Maine were eventually killed or taken prisoner fighting in a blinding snowstorm at Quebec. Arnold was wounded and General Montgomery was killed. William North, gentleman, was made a second lieutenant in Captain John Gill's 6th Company of Colonel Thomas Craft's Artillery Regiment in May of 1776. The appointment was signed by members of the Council of Massachusetts Bay, including John Avery, the Deputy Secretary. And we know we have New England Averys that settled around Esperance and Duanesburg. The title gentleman put North in a social order that is above the ordinary yeoman or farmer. North later wrote that he also served as brigade major, whose duties included keeping all the general orders of the army, as well as those of the brigade regularly entered into a book. Colonel Crafts had been actively seeking an officer's position in the Massachusetts line of the Continental Army since December of 1775, along with Paul Revere and George Trott, one of the Loyal Nine, later Sons of Liberty, through John Adams. Crafts questioned John Adams' friendship, and Adams responded in a letter, evidently never completed, that he was very sorry to learn that he questioned his sincere friendship. In the February 18, 1776 draft, Adams referred to Colonel Brewer's case being removed from a regiment, and that at present it was not in the country's power to effect rewarding Crafts and the others. On May 8, 1776, James Warren complained to John Adams that Massachusetts has supported the Continental Army to an extreme, leaving Boston exposed to a future assault by the British. At this time, Warren wrote that a regiment of 7 companies of artillery were being raised to be commanded by Thomas Crafts as lieutenant colonel and Trott as major. Jeremiah Newcomb, a member of the 6th, mentioned going to Castle William, a fort located on an island in Boston Harbor that was destroyed by the British upon their evacuation of Boston in March of 1776. He mentioned rebuilding the fort, repairing and moving artillery pieces, and receiving passports from vessels passing the fort. He made daily trips to Boston in a flat-bottomed boat. He also spoke to fortifying Boston's Long Island Head, forcing out the British ships laying in Nantasket roads using a mortar and a 6-pounder cannon. The British then blew up the Long Island lighthouse on their passing by. After the British evacuated Boston, George Washington put Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere in charge of rebuilding Castle William in November of 1776, which became Fort Independence. Colonel Crafts was in charge of the artillery regiment stationed on Castle William, which was commonly called Castle Island, and also the Board of War's Boston Laboratory, beginning in July of 1776. The laboratory served as a workshop, employing skilled craftsmen such as blacksmiths, carpenters, wheelwrights, and ironworkers, and as a depot and distribution center for military supplies and equipment for the regiments in the Patriot Army. Some of the supplies were manufactured at the fort from raw material purchased and shipped to the laboratory, while finished goods were also purchased and stored there. On July 18, 1776, Second Lieutenant William North was with his artillery regiment when they were drawn up beneath the balcony of the old Boston State House, which is pictured here, for the first reading of the new Declaration of Independence. His regiment would have been among others, along with a great crowd of Boston residents. Now, normally what you would hear is the sheriff would announce any kind of legal notices. However, in this case, the sheriff felt he needed assistance because of the large crowd. Colonel Crass was surprisingly not with his men. He was not there with the regiment of artillery that was present. Instead, he was on the balcony of the State House, using a strong military voice to broadcast the reading of the Declaration of Independence recently received from the Capitol in Philadelphia. So you can imagine being in this crowd and looking up on the balcony and seeing Colonel Crafts on the balcony reading the Declaration of Independence. There were a lot of people there, including Abigail Adams. And Abigail Adams, an eyewitness, wrote back to her husband, John Adams, as to what she was seeing. Abigail Adams was in the crowd and recounted her experience to her husband, John, in a letter dated July 20th and 21st, 1776. I went with the multitude into King Street to hear the Proclamation of Independence read and proclaimed. Some field pieces with a train were brought there. The troops appeared under arms, and all the inhabitants assembled there. The smallpox prevented many thousands from the country. When Colonel Crafts read from the balcony of the State House the proclamation, great attention was given to every word. As soon as he ended, the cry from the balcony was "God save our American states," and then 3 cheers which rended the air. The bells rang, the privateers fired, the forts and batteries, the cannon were discharged, the platoons followed, and every face appeared joyful. After dinner, the king's arms were taken down from the State House, and every vestige of him from every place in which it appeared, and burnt in King Street. Thus ends royal authority in this state, and all the people shall say, Amen. And here we end our program for today and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was fascinating. It was very thorough, but it also leads to a lot of other great pieces of history. I made a few notes here, but folks that are still on here with us, we've got several folks that have tuned in for the program. The chat function that you have is the best way. You type in your question or a comment, I'll relay it. We'll facilitate it since we're recording this to be posted hopefully on YouTube later. That way everybody will be able to know what that question is. But I put down in my notes here, how General North is a witness to many nation-shaping events, although I hazard to step on the fact that he may not be all that well known to many others or in many circles. So it's great that you're working on this and that you're going to present this information out there to the public. You're working on a book, and when that is coming out, hopefully we can have you do another talk, maybe in person, with that book, and how it would go. I'm hoping folks will leave some uh, questions in here. I'm going to do a little bit of a shameless thing here and say that you had mentioned Aaron Burr in the expedition into Canada. Aaron Burr will show up again in a presentation as part of our History at Home series on March 3rd, as I talk about Governor DeWitt Clinton. So there's a shameless plug, but also a tie-in, and there's some other connection, Ken, to DeWitt Clinton.
DeWitt Clinton, yes. William North in 1810 is Speaker of the New York State Assembly, and Stephen Van Rensselaer. They have Thomas Eddy works with one of the legislators and gets them to go and fund an exploratory route for the Erie Canal. And he has commissioners picked out, including Benjamin Walker, William North's friend, best friend, lifelong friend. And he talks to Stephen Rensselaer to get his vote, and Ben Rensselaer says, I'll vote for this. He says, but um, can you put in my friend William North in place of one of the other guys or add him? And so one of the other Clinton said, I'll vote for this, but don't put any names in yet. So it went to the legislature, gets approved. And what happens is poor Benjamin Walker gets replaced by his best friend, William North. And there's a stoppage in communications for a while. And this might have been one of the things that played into that. But he became one of those that went and laid out the route for the Erie Canal and went along with Stephen Van Rensselaer, Governor Morris, Thomas Eddy, and others, including DeWitt Clinton. And DeWitt Clinton and Thomas Eddy's son kept a diary, so there's a great amount of interesting stories of the trip.
That's fantastic. See that well that he's connected to another great national story of the New York's Erie Canal there. So that was sort of a shameful kind of tie-in that I worked in there. But I also do find interesting, you have the postcard image, the restored image with Fort William Henry, that is not the Fort William Henry that a lot of folks in New York are familiar with. But I think I was drawn to the fact there was ice cream available there.
Yeah,
And as a lover of ice cream, I can identify with that.
yeah, I thought that was kind of cool when I saw that. I couldn't pass up picking up that postcard. But yes, the earlier fort was Fort William Henry, and this Fort Frederick was built, on the same property.
Mm. Yeah, it's
And they've done excavations there too, so that's where you saw that map of the way it would look, and they had maps of the way it looked when it was Fort William Henry too. So you can see the earlier fort layout and the fort layout for Fort Frederick if you go there.
and it's further proof that heritage tourism has been around for a long time, and what better way to put the ice cream on that cake, if you will. Um, I see there's a couple people that are typing there, so I'll let them add in their questions. But the reproduction of Knox Mansion is interesting for those that are local to Schoharie Crossing or even in Esperance. We're not that far from Johnstown, New York, which has its own Knox Mansion, albeit from the famous Charles Knox of the gelatin Knox. And what I find also, I'm figuring out ways to tie this all together, and the fact that Rose Knox is the one that was able to move that company forward after 1908. But of all things, Knox Gelatin was sold to a tea company in 1975. So I guess one Knox to another for the Lipton Tea Company there. Um, so Beth was actually asking about Fort William Henry and if there's an actual relationship between those two different forts in any way, shape, or form.
It's possible they are named for the same person. I mean, that's not uncommon. like there's two Fort St. George's right near each other in Maine. So you can get, it's hard because I'm not a Maine person. I just happen to have a friend that she's from Maine, so I've gotten to know a little bit about the area. But there are two Fort St. George's right near each other. So it's, can be very confusing. And so it's very likely that they could have been named for the same person. I don't know that for a fact, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, the naming conventions for forts were something of interest back in the day, being named after the son of a king or royalty in some way, or colonial governors. That's why the hamlet of Fort Hunter, where Schoharie Crossing has its visitor center, there's another Fort Hunter that happens to be in Pennsylvania, named after Robert Hunter, the same colonial governor, just at different eras in which he was a governor of different colonies at the time.
Right. So that's why I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same person they're named for.
Yeah, and then when you search up Fort Hunter, you get a modern Fort Hunter, and that doesn't provide the same insights. But we're running into our block of time here, and it seems that there are no further questions being added in the chat. Perhaps because you regaled us with a wonderful narrative of the early years of General North. We have a better sense of the founder of Esperance, or one of the founders of Esperance, but the connections to so many much more well-known names, but also the national story. So we look forward to the book. Do you have a timeline on when you're hoping to get that one
Well,
out?
right now, my daughter is doing a second review of it. She's a English department head in Western Australia, which is wonderful. You can do things, electronically, so you can do things in countries like that. So she's giving it the second go round, and after that, I'm going to hopefully finalize it and get it in shape. So before summer, hopefully have it in print.
Well, that'll be fantastic. I look forward to sitting down with the copy. I look forward to possibly having you there on site to talk about it a little more, or checking it out wherever it may be sold. Uh, we're gonna hopefully get this one up on YouTube. So if you are on YouTube watching this, you can also check out the rest of the information down in the comments and description for more, and I'll update that as we go. But Ken, thank you so much. This was fascinating. It was really interesting to learn about the early life, and I'm be curious to know more about some of that canal connection. So I'll have to grab a copy of the book.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all for tuning in to History at Home, presented by Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. Uh, Hopefully you enjoyed this. Check out our other videos on our YouTube. Stop into the site. We have amazing things happening. Get over to the Esperance Historical Society during the season and beyond. You can find out more information by going to their website. You can find them on Facebook. You can find us everywhere too. And thank you all so much again. Stay safe and be well.